100 painted warriors circled a wagon train, screaming for vengeance. A man was bound to a wheel, his skin peeled from his body while he begged for mercy. Why did no one save him? And what monstrous act led to this horrifying end? To understand the rage of a people long silenced, stay with us until the end. In the early 1850s, thousands of Americans set their eyes westward, dreaming of California's fertile valleys and promises of land. Among them was a large wagon train departing from Missouri. These caravans were not mere groups of travelers. They were full societies on wheels. One wagon train often included 20 to 40 wagons, carrying up to 200 people, livestock, tools, and provisions for months. The journey to California could span over 2,000 miles and take up to 6 months, depending on terrain and weather. The land was harsh, the risks constant, and the fear of native attack always present in conversations, even if such attacks were rare in practice. In this case, two smaller groups of emigrants temporarily merged, hoping to benefit from mutual protection and companionship. For a time, they moved together, but eventually they separated. The gap between them stretched nearly 10 miles. That meant two separate clusters of families, wagons, and vulnerable supplies traveling through open territory, with only a day's distance separating them. Communication was minimal. Each party functioned as its own microsociety, dependent on mutual trust. But trust, here, would soon break. Among the travelers was a man named John Mankins. He was originally from Marion County, but had been living in the Flippin' Barrens near the White River. Mankins was not an unknown figure. His name was already associated with quarrels, intimidation, and a foul temper. At over 6 feet tall and weighing perhaps 200 pounds, he cut an imposing figure. His voice was loud, and his temper short. He spoke in absolutes. He made himself known at every gathering by talking over others, refusing counsel, and turning even casual discussions into confrontations. But his size and voice were not the worst of him. What made Mankins feared, even among fellow white settlers, was his persistent and violent rhetoric. He often proclaimed he would shoot the first native he saw. Not just warriors. He included women. He included children. "Red skin is red skin," he reportedly said, more than once. He repeated this publicly, not in whispers, but in open conversation, as if daring others to object. He said it in the morning before they set out. He said it around campfires at night. Some men laughed nervously. Others confronted him directly. One father of 3 reportedly told him, "You'll get us all killed." But Mankins was unmoved. He responded with mockery. He believed he was strong. He believed he was immune. He treated warnings as cowardice. As the wagon train moved closer to the edge of known territory, the landscape changed. Tall prairie gave way to shorter brush. Wildlife grew scarce. The silence of the land was unsettling. And still, Mankins spoke of killing. The closer they moved to native territories, the louder he became. He carried his rifle across his chest constantly, even when no danger presented itself. Eventually, the group passed through a native encampment. The location was part of a designated reservation. There were no warriors present that day. Only women and children remained, likely tending fires, repairing clothing, preparing food. No signs of hostility were seen. There were no weapons raised. The group did not feel threatened. But for Mankins, this was not a place of peace. It was an opportunity. He saw unarmed women and children not as neighbors or fellow humans, but as convenient targets. And in that moment, despite all the warnings, despite the complete lack of threat, he raised his rifle and made good on his promise. There was no struggle. There was no resistance. Only the sound of a shot echoing across the prairie. A native woman fell. A mother. A daughter. Perhaps both. Her name was not recorded. Her story is unknown, except in how it ends. And in that single act, Mankins did not just commit murder. He condemned everyone around him to fear, to guilt, and to the waiting consequences that the frontier never forgets. John Mankins fired a single shot. That shot struck a native woman in the chest and killed her instantly. She was unarmed. She posed no threat. She was part of a small group of women and children left behind while the men were away hunting. Her death was not a result of conflict. It was not during battle. It was an execution, carried out in full view of the wagon train. The gunfire stopped all movement. What had been a quiet passage through peaceful land turned into a scene of stunned silence. Some stood still. Others looked at Mankins in disbelief. No one applauded. No one backed him. The woman's body lay in the dirt. Her name, her age, her family all lost. No record remained. Only the memory of her collapse, the blood that soaked into dry soil, and the fact that she had never raised a hand. People in the caravan reacted with immediate horror. Men who had tolerated Mankins's behavior now turned away from him. Women covered their children's eyes. An older man is said to have told him, "You just murdered someone's mother." Mankins did not answer. He simply walked back to his wagon. That single act shifted everything. The group had been traveling through Indian territory for weeks without incident. Now, every sound in the distance became a possible warning. Every rustle in the grass could be a scout. Every shadow might carry a weapon. The psychological weight of the murder affected everyone. No one slept easily. Guns were kept loaded and within arm's reach. The wagon train moved forward. It had no choice. They could not stay in place, but each day felt longer than the one before. The silence on the trail was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. Conversations grew rare. Laughter disappeared. Everyone waited for something to happen. For 4 days, nothing did. That delay did not calm anyone. It did the opposite. The absence of response became its own kind of fear. Many believed the tribe was planning something larger, more deadly. By the 4th night, several emigrants admitted openly that they wished they had stopped Mankins earlier, but it was too late. On the 5th day, the retribution arrived. A band of native warriors appeared on the horizon, 100 in total. They rode horses at full speed and formed a tight column. They were not hiding. They were not sneaking. They were making a statement. Every man was painted for war. Their faces were marked in red, black, and white. These colors were not random. According to ethnographic records from the Smithsonian and the works of scholars like James Mooney, red signified blood and war. Black meant power. White could symbolize death or mourning, depending on placement. The caravan had set up camp roughly 10 miles from the other train. It was morning. Fires were lit. Breakfast was being prepared. Children were feeding animals. When the warriors approached, they did not speak. They surrounded the wagons in silence, cutting off all exits. The circle was deliberate. There was no escape. Then the message came. They demanded the man who had murdered the woman. There was no negotiation, no offer, no chance of bargaining. They made it clear. If Mankins was not handed over, every person in the train would die. Men, women, children, all of them. Inside the circle, panic spread. Some reached for rifles, others froze. The leaders of the group quickly realized the truth. They were not prepared for a fight. While they carried weapons likely single-shot muskets or early breech-loading rifles, they were outnumbered and surrounded. Many of them had never fired in real combat. The warriors, on the other hand, were battle-tested and unified in purpose. And then came the final realization. No one wanted to defend Mankins. Not one man. Not even those who had once tolerated his arrogance. He had murdered a woman with no cause. He had brought this danger on everyone. The group did not argue among themselves. They brought Mankins out. He screamed. He begged. He said he had made a mistake, but no one stepped forward. No one shielded him. In that moment, the frontier delivered its verdict, not through courts or judges, through a form of justice as old as any law, blood for blood. And the camp watched as Mankins was taken away into the center of the circle, not to be questioned, not to be tried, but to pay. No one in the camp raised a hand for John Mankins. Not a single word was offered in his defense. The group, once bound by the need to survive together, now stood silently as he was pushed forward into the hands of the warriors. He begged. His voice cracked. He shouted names. He promised to change. But those watching him remembered the dead woman. They remembered her silence, her stillness, and they remained silent in return. The warriors acted with purpose. This was not chaos. It was judgment. They took a rawhide rope, thick and dark, stripped from buffalo hide and cured in the sun. The rope was nearly 60 feet long. They bound Mankins head to foot, wrapping the line around his arms, legs, and chest, then tied him to one of the rear wheels of a wagon. He struggled, but the rope held firm. His face twisted with terror. He called again for mercy. None came. Several warriors gathered around him. They carried long knives, curved and honed with stone or steel. These were not crude tools. They were weapons shaped for a specific purpose. The blades glinted under the morning sun. Before beginning, they ran their thumbs across the edge, testing sharpness. This was preparation, not spectacle. Then the cutting began. They started at the neck. Mankins screamed. The sound pierced the still air and traveled across the prairie, but the warriors did not stop. They cut slowly, carefully, peeling the skin from his body in long, unbroken strips, not ragged shreds, sheets. This required precision. The skin along his arms was pulled back like cloth from a sleeve. His chest, his stomach, his legs, every inch was taken. He had been stripped of all his clothing before it began. There was nothing to protect him. His skin, his flesh, his nerves all exposed. Blood streamed in small rivers down his torso. The grass beneath him turned red. He cried out. Then he cursed. Then he begged. He called on men who were no longer listening. Some looked away. Others stared, but none acted. Historians like D. Brown and Vine Deloria Jr. have described such events not as acts of savage violence, but as expressions of law, of retribution, shaped by generations of injustice. Native justice, when exacted outside white courts, was labeled barbaric. Yet those same courts rarely, if ever, punished white men for killing Native women. Mankins had received no trial, but neither had his victim. The warriors continued. They flayed his back, his sides, even his face. The process lasted for what may have been nearly an hour. His voice grew weaker. He began to shiver. Eventually, he fell silent, still alive, but no longer fully conscious. His eyes rolled back. His limbs jerked involuntarily. At last, they stopped. The work was done. They unbound him, and his body dropped into the dirt like a discarded carcass. He twitched, then lay still. He had not yet died, but he would not live much longer. The warriors stood over him for a moment. Then one of them took the skin. It had been their demand. This was not just punishment. It was proof. And then, without a word, they turned, mounted their horses, and rode away. The camp did not speak. No one moved for several minutes. The man who had once declared he would kill women and children now lay skinned and broken. His punishment had not come through a courtroom. It had come through a tradition that saw blood for blood, silence for silence. He died shortly after. No one touched the body until it was certain that breath had left him. Only then did the group dig a grave. It was shallow. The ground was hard. They marked it with stones. There were no prayers. There were no words. And the prairie, once again, went quiet. When Mankins finally stopped moving, the warrior stood in silence. His body, now still and torn, no longer cried out. His face had frozen into a twisted shape, caught somewhere between pain and disbelief. It was only then, and not before, that the group of native men mounted their horses. One of them carried the skin. That skin was not taken out of cruelty. It was taken as proof. It was a message. It was a symbol. The same way that scalps were once kept by colonial militias and bounties paid by state governments. This was not new. It was mirrored violence. The emigrants watched them disappear over the horizon. There was no cheer, no conversation. The children stayed inside the wagons. The women looked down. The men stood with lowered rifles. What had begun as a boast had ended in a silence so deep that even the prairie wind seemed unwilling to speak. After some time, they approached the body. What remained of Mankins was barely recognizable. Strips of red muscle lay exposed to the sun. His eyes were open, his limbs stiff. No one touched him at first. They wrapped him quickly in a tarp or a cloth. No words were said. They dug a hole beside the wagon where he had been tied. The ground was dry and hard. The shovels struck stone more than once. It took effort. They buried him with no ceremony. No Bible was read. No cross was placed. A few rocks were gathered and stacked to keep animals away. That was all they could do. They had marked the site, as best they could. Not out of respect, but perhaps to avoid confusion if they ever passed this way again. The grave was shallow. The wind would erode it. The buffalo might trample it, and future travelers would not know his name. Some men spit beside the grave. Others said nothing. There was no agreement on what had happened. Had justice been done? Had they allowed savagery to answer savagery? Was silence the same as complicity? Historians often debate frontier morality. Frederick Jackson Turner once wrote about the frontier as the crucible of American character, where democracy and rugged independence were born. But stories like this remind us that the frontier also bred other things: fear, arrogance, lawlessness, and silence. Always silence. By mid-afternoon, the wagons were moving again. No one wanted to stay. The prairie stretched wide ahead of them. There was no sign of the warriors now. No threat, only the weight of what had been done. They did not speak of Mankins again. The grave faded behind them. It was never visited. It was not recorded in any map, and in time, even those who had stood there would forget its location. There was no monument. There was no eulogy. There was only the memory of what hatred looked like when it finally came full circle. Captain North's company of Pawnee scouts arrived at the edge of town just as summer began to turn. They set up camp near the military fort, as expected. These were not renegades or outlaws. They were native men in uniform. They had fought alongside the United States Army, tracking enemy movements, guiding cavalry through unfamiliar terrain, and often doing the hardest and dirtiest jobs on the frontier. Their service was official. Their records were real. They had been mustered out and were now returning to Indian Territory, waiting only for final instructions. There were around 30 of them in the unit. Every one of them wore regulation gear. Their discipline had earned them respect from military officers and even from some settlers. Among them was a man named Red Willow. He was known for his silence and for the lineage he carried. He was the son of a chief, once famous among the Pawnee. That name carried weight, not only in his tribe but in the minds of those who remembered older wars and uneasy truces. Red Willow had not caused trouble in town. He did not drink publicly. He kept to the edge of camp. On the night he was killed, he was unarmed. He had done nothing more than walk down a street near Hays City after dark. He never made it back to his tent. The man who shot him was no stranger to violence. He was known in the region. Some said he had once worked as a bouncer. Others said he lived off theft. What is certain is that he had a record of beating men in alleys, robbing drunks, and threatening travelers. Only the night before, he had struck a man named Hill over the head and left him bleeding in the street. Mr. Hill was found unconscious the next morning, minus his watch and several dollars. No arrest was made. The shooter had a reputation as a troublemaker. He styled himself as a gunslinger, copying the walk, the words, and the posture of famous frontier figures. But in truth, he only drew his weapon when others were unarmed. He never fought fair. His gun was for intimidation, not for defense. Several soldiers had complained about his behavior. One policeman had even confronted him, drawing an empty revolver just to make him stand down. That officer, named Charlie, knew the man was dangerous, but said later that no one in the town was willing to prosecute him. When Red Willow died, shot point blank, the reaction was muted. The local newspaper ran a brief column the next day, calling the incident an attempted burglary. There was no investigation, no arrest. The report implied Red Willow had been in the wrong place, perhaps trying to steal something. This was a lie. It was not just inaccurate. It was deliberate. The townspeople did not protest. The fort said nothing. The officer who had known Red Willow personally offered no public statement. The silence was louder than the gunshot. What happened to Red Willow was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern. Native men in uniform were tolerated only as long as they stayed invisible. Once they stepped into public space, especially after dark, they were no longer seen as soldiers. They were seen as targets. Their uniforms could not protect them. Their service did not matter. No trial followed. No charges were filed. The man who killed Red Willow walked free. He continued to haunt the streets of Hays City, looking for his next victim, pretending to be someone brave. And Red Willow was buried quietly, far from the memory of those who allowed it to happen. There was no outcry. No grief expressed beyond the circle of his brothers in arms. His name faded from the town's records, but not from the memory of those who knew what really happened. What remained was the lesson. Service, for some, was not enough to earn justice. Not if your skin was the wrong color. Not if the bullet came from the right man. The fort near the narrator's home was not a grand structure. It had once served its purpose, but over time, the wood had rotted and the walls sagged. It stood as a relic, a reminder of older conflicts, now too fragile to trust. Eventually, a new one was built closer to the family's land. This new fort became their shield, their last line of protection in a world that offered little comfort. Families who lived on the frontier did so with constant fear. It was not always the fear of war, but the fear of uncertainty. Rumors of native raids spread quickly, often based on little more than a missing horse or an unfamiliar track in the dirt. The fear was not always justified, but it was always present. Between 1860 and 1890, government reports documented over 1,000 civilian deaths attributed to native attacks, but scholars like Richard White have noted that many of these numbers were inflated, often including deaths from unrelated causes or accidents. Still, perception mattered more than accuracy. When a threat was reported, there was no shouting, there was no chaos. An express rider would arrive in the middle of the night. He would not knock loudly. He would tap, gently but firmly, on the door. That signal was enough. Within seconds, the entire household would be awake. The mother moved first. She dressed the children in the dark. There was no talking, no crying. The fire remained cold. No candle was lit. Even the smallest flicker could give away their location. The father checked his rifle. Ammunition was wrapped in cloth and tied at his waist. Knives were packed quickly. Water was collected. Food, if any, was grabbed without inspection. The narrator, a child at the time, was not spared from this routine. He was old enough to carry a bag, maybe a jug, maybe a blanket. The youngest sibling was left asleep until the last moment. If there was any noise, it had to come from feet, not mouths. Doors were opened without creaking. Steps were taken with care. In a house of 6 or 7, it took less than 5 minutes to leave completely. The fort was usually within walking distance, but that walk felt longer at night. Families moved through fields, across low ditches, and along paths hidden during the day. Some carried infants. Others dragged older children by the hand. By dawn, dozens of families would be packed inside the walls, huddled together. Food was shared. Stories were not. The next day, men returned under escort to retrieve supplies. They carried bedding, pots, and livestock when possible. They moved quickly and kept eyes on the trees. Their guns stayed loaded. They did not speak unless necessary. But not everyone followed the plan. Some families believed the threat had passed. They returned home before permission was given. They wanted comfort. They wanted distance from others. They trusted instinct over protocol. These were the ones called foolhardy. Their choices made things harder for everyone. More than once, armed men had to be sent to retrieve them. Sometimes they were too late. Sometimes they arrived just as another alarm was raised. These acts of independence were seen not as bravery, but as betrayal. The community survived only if all acted together. In the end, the narrator understood the truth. Fear was the force that bound them. It made neighbors into allies, strangers into protectors, but ignorance pulled them apart. Those who refused to see the danger endangered all. The frontier was not just a place on a map. It was a condition, a state of vigilance. And for a child growing up within it, survival meant learning not only to move in silence, but to understand that silence could also speak of loss. Mankins' screams may have faded, and Red Willow's name may not ring loud in textbooks, but these stories confront us with a question no monument can answer. How many truths of the frontier are buried beneath the silence of civilization? Perhaps we owe it not just to history, but to humanity, to keep listening.